Welcome to lesson 2.2, adding integers. Our I can statement for the day is to simplify expressions by adding integers. We're going to use two methods today. We're going to use the number line method as well as the sum of integers rules. Our key concept that we're going to explore for examples 1 and 2 today is that when you're adding integers and those integers have the same sign, you can add the absolute values of those integers and then carry the sign to the final answer. So if both integers are negative, a negative plus a negative is going to give us a negative number. If we're adding two positives together, our final answer is going to be a positive integer. Taking a look at example 1, we're going to explore those two methods. Find -1 plus -5. First, we're going to use the number line method. Step 1, draw a number line, including a 0 point, because you'll always want to start at 0. And then draw your first integer. Graph your first integer. So when you're graphing, if it's a negative integer, you're going to move to the left. And if it's a positive integer that you're adding, you're going to move to the right. So I'm starting with a -1. So I start at 0. I'm moving 1 to the left, which is -1. Then I'm adding a -5, which means I'm going to move 5 more to the left. I graph that, 5 more to the left. And when I combine those, my answer is -6. If I'm using the addition rules, I'm going to take a look first at my signs. I see that the sign of each integer is negative, so they are the same sign, and my answer will then be negative because your answer is going to be the same as whatever this was. In this case, they're both negative. Then we also add the absolute values of the integers. So the absolute value of -1 is 1, the absolute value of -5 is 5, 1 plus 5 makes 6. So -1 plus -5 is -6, and that's shown through both methods. If we take a look at example 2, we have another addition problem with same signs again. So -3 plus -6. Again, your first step is always to take a look. Do I have the same signs? In this case that I do, they're both negative. So my answer will also be negative. Step 2 is then to add the absolute values of your integers. 3 and 6, which is 9. So my final answer is -9. Moving on, we're going to move to our next key concept. This will apply to examples 3 and 4. Example 3 and example 4 both are dealing with integers that have different signs, when you're adding integers with different signs. The first is to subtract the absolute values. So we're not adding these together. They're not like signs anymore. They're different. So we need to subtract the absolute values. And we're going to keep the sign of the number with the greater absolute value. So in other words, we want to know which has more, which group has more. Is it the positive group of integers or the negative group of integers? So example 3, find the sum using number lines. If we take a look at 3a, we have -3 plus a +6. So after I draw my number line, again, I always want to start at 0 when I'm graphing. And a -3 means I'm going to move 3 to the left. That was my first direction. Now I'm going to add a +6. This is going in the opposite direction, so we stay where we are at -3, but now I'm moving 6 to the right. And then my final answer there is +3. Again, we always want to start at 0 when we're graphing, and we're graphing two different directions because we have two different signs for our integers. One is negative and one is positive. Looking at example 3b, 1 plus -4. Again, always start at 0, and I'm going to graph +1. So I'm going to graph 1 to the right. Then I'm going to add a -4 to that. So I'm going to move in the opposite direction because it's negative. I'm going to move left 4 from where I was. So I was at 1, and I'm going to move 1, 2, 3, 4. I end up at negative 3. Now taking a look at example 4, we're not going to use the number line. We're actually going to use the rules that I introduced in the key concept before example 3. And that rule was, if you have different signs, you need to subtract the absolute values and then keep the sign of the higher absolute value, or whichever group has more. So if I take a look at 4a, I have 12 plus a negative 6. My first thought is to look at the signs. They're different, so I want to subtract my absolute values. So I'm actually going to do 12 minus 6. I then look at the groupings, positive 12 and negative 6, and I think to myself, which group has more? And in this case, it's the positive group. 12, the absolute value, 12, is larger than the absolute value of negative 6, which is 6. So this group has more, or positive, so my final answer must be positive. Or in other words, 12 plus negative 6 is 6. And for example 4b, negative 7 plus 5, again, think to yourself, I have different signs, so I must want to subtract these. 7 minus 5 is going to give me 2. And then again, go back and take a look at your signs. Which is the higher absolute value? It's this one, meaning that there's more negatives than there are positives in this problem. So negative answer, or negative has more, so my answer must be negative. So negative 7 plus 5 is negative 2. Before we move on to example 5, if you're struggling with some of the rules at this point in time or the number lines, you're welcome to use the ConnectEd resources, the tutor videos to help, or take a look in your textbook and do some practice problems, or in your packet before you move on. You can always double check in a calculator, but remember, there are no calculators being used in class as of yet. So example 5. So now we're going to take all that we've learned in both 2.1 and 2.2, as well as actually chapter 1, and we're going to apply that to a word problem in example 5. A blue whale was at a depth of 275 feet below the surface of the water. After 10 minutes, it rose 194 feet. What is the current depth of the whale? Write an addition equation, then solve and interpret the sum. So there's a lot of information here. First thing I'm going to do is go through and kind of highlight what I would do. We're at 275 feet. Let's get a different color. 275 feet below the surface. So thinking back to lesson 2.1, if I'm below the surface, that's a negative 275. Okay? After 10 minutes, it rose 194 feet. Time doesn't really matter in this particular instance. We just want to know the change in depth. So because it's rising, that's going to be a positive integer, a positive 194. So what is the current depth of the whale? We want to write an addition equation, meaning it needs to have an equal sign, and then solve, and then finally interpret the sum. So first of all, if I'm writing an equation and I need an unknown, I need to define my variable. In this particular case, I'm looking for the current depth, so I'm defining my variable as d. d equals current depth. And then I recognize that I want to find the current depth by using the original starting point, which is negative 275 feet. And then I'm adding that 194 feet that the whale rose, and that will give me my final answer. Before I even work out the calculations for this, because these are some larger numbers than I dealt with in the previous examples, I did kind of a think cloud for estimation, which is a nice idea when you're doing multi-step problems or when you're using larger numbers. Negative 275 plus 200, which is what I rounded 194 to, is going to give me about negative 75 for my answer. So that's what I'm looking for. When I go to solve this, follow your integer rules. I take a look at the signs. The signs are different, so I know that I need to subtract my integers. I'm going to subtract the absolute values. 275 minus 194 is 81. And then I go back and take a look at the signs. Compare the absolute values. 275 negative has more, so I give the sign of the negative to my answer. So the final answer is negative 81 equals D. Now, because this is a word problem, as well as the fact that it asks us to interpret this sum, my final answer is going to go into a sentence form, and it's also going to, instead of writing positive or negative, it's going to use the positive or negative to describe the action of the whale. So the whale is currently, that negative tells me that it's below sea level. So the whale is currently 81 feet below sea level. I hope you enjoyed the video for lesson 2.2. Again, if you're struggling in any way, I encourage you to go watch it again, or to use your ConnectEd tutor videos, or reach out to a buddy or your teacher. Thanks so much. Good luck.